The morning mist still clung to the grass when Sarah Chin first noticed them. She was jogging through Riverside Park, her usual 5-mile route before work, when she stopped dead in her tracks. What she saw defied explanations of German shepherds, all wearing various police department collars, standing in a perfect circle around the old wooden bench near the duck pond. At the center of this canine formation sat a woman Sarah had seen before but never spoken to. Margaret Hale was known in town as the reclusive veteran who lived in the small house on Maple Street, the one with the overgrown garden and drawn curtains. She rarely ventured out, and when she did, it was usually for quick trips to the grocery store, her silver hair tucked under a worn baseball cap, her eyes always scanning the ground. But this morning was different. Margaret sat completely still on the bench, her weathered hands folded in her lap, tears streaming down her cheeks. The dogs Sarah counted at least 30. Barking or showing any signs of aggression, they simply stood there, motionless, as if they were honor guards at a military ceremony. One dog in particular caught Sarah's attention, a large German shepherd with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his snout pressed against Margaret's leg, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Unlike the others who stood at attention, this dog seemed to be offering comfort, his massive head resting against her knee. Ma'am, are you okay? Sarah called out, but Margaret didn't respond. She seemed lost in another time, another place, other. Early morning joggers and dog walkers had begun to notice the unusual gathering. Mrs. Patterson, who lived across from the park, stood at her kitchen window with her phone pressed to her ear. Yes, operator, I need police at Riverside Park. It's hard to explain. By 7:30 a.m., a small crowd had formed at a respectful distance from the circle of dogs. Children on their way to school stopped to stare there, parents pulling them along with worried whispers. The local coffee shop owner, Jim Rodriguez, abandoned his morning prep to witness what everyone was already calling the strangest thing they'd ever seen. Should we try to help her? Asked Tom Bradley, a retired teacher who walked his own golden retriever through the park every morning. I wouldn't get too close, warned Mrs. Chen, Sarah's mother, who had arrived after her daughter called her. Those are all police dogs. Look at their collars there. From different departments, some I don't even recognize. She was right. While most of the dogs wore the familiar blue collars of the local police department, others bore markings from counties hours away, some from as far as 3 states over. How had they all gotten here? And more importantly, why? The sound of sirens broke through the morning quiet as 2 police cruisers arrived, followed quickly by Animal Control, and the fire department officer. Janet Mills was the first to approach her, hand instinctively moving toward her radio as she took in the scene. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured to her partner, Officer David Park. "These dogs, they're from all over. Look, that one's from the state police, that one's federal, and I don't even recognize some of these department markings." As the officers approached, something remarkable happened. The circle of dogs shifted slightly, not aggressively but with clear purpose. They tightened their formation around Margaret, creating an even more impenetrable barrier between her and the approaching authorities. Like they're protecting her, Officer Park observed, but from what? Officer Mills tried a different approach, speaking directly to Margaret from about 10 feet away. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Mills, with the city police. Can you tell us your name? Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" For the first time that morning, Margaret lifted her head, her eyes, a pale blue that seemed to hold decades of pain, met Officer Mills' gaze. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried with startling clarity across the silent park. "My name is Margaret Hale. I'm not hurt, not in the way you mean." She paused, her hand moving to stroke the scarred dog beside her, "and I'm exactly where I need to." Beatty crowd had grown larger, with people arriving, even as others left for work, only to be replaced by new curious onlookers. Someone had started filming with their phone, and the local news van was pulling up to the park and Transmom. Officer Mills continued gently, "We're going to need you to help us understand what's happening here. These dogs, they don't belong to you, do they?" Margaret's laugh was soft but bitter. "Belong to me? No, officer, but we belong to each other in ways that your department records could never understand." The scarred dog at her side shifted, placing his head more firmly against her leg. Margaret's hand found the spot behind his ears that she somehow knew would calm him, a gesture so natural it seemed like muscle memory. "This is Valor," she said, her voice growing stronger. "At least that's what I called him. Your records might list him as deceased, killed in action 3 years ago in a classified operation overseas." Officer Mills felt a chill run down her spine. She'd been with the department for 12 years, had seen her share of strange cases, but something about Margaret's words, the certainty in them, the pain, made her reach for her notebook instead of her handcuffs. "Ma, I think we need to talk about this down at the station." "Oh," the word came out sharp and final. Margaret's eyes hardened, and as if responding to her tone, the circle of dogs seemed to lean forward, almost imperceptibly. "Not there, not yet. If you want answers, Officer Millsy, as I know your name. I know all your names. Then you'll listen to me here now." In front of everyone, the morning sun had burned away most of the mist, and the golden light filtering through the oak trees gave the entire scene an almost ethereal quality. Margaret looked around at the faces watching her, some curious, some concerned, some skeptical. and made a decision that would change everything. What I'm about to tell you, she said, her voice carrying across the silent park is going to sound impossible, but these dogs, she gestured to the circle surrounding her, they're here because they remember. They remember what was taken from us, what was covered up, what was buried. She took a shaky breath, her hand never leaving Valor's scarred headband. They're here because somehow they know it's time for the truth. The silence that followed Margaret's words was thick with tension. Officer Mills found herself caught between protocol and intuition, between the need to control the situation and the growing certainty that this was bigger than a simple disturbance. Kelmam, she said carefully, if you have information about classified operations or irregularities in department records, there are proper channels. Proper channels. Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. I tried proper channels, Officer Mills. I filed reports. I requested hearings. I followed every protocol in the book. And where did it get me? She stood slowly, Valor immediately rising with her, his body pressed against her side. The other dogs remained motionless, but their attention was laser-focused on Margaret, as if waiting for a command that might never come. 12 years ago, I was Staff Sergeant Margaret Hale, K9 Unit 3rd Military Police Battalion. My partner and I were deployed to Afghanistan as part of a joint operation with D and local police forces. We were hunting down a drug trafficking ring that was funding terrorist operations. Officer Park had pulled out his own notebook, though he wasn't sure why. Something about Margaret's bearing, even in her obvious distress, commanded respect. She spoke with the precision of someone who had given countless debriefings, who had learned to compartmentalize horror into neat reportable facts. Our mission was supposed to be routine reconnaissance, observe, and report. But someone in our unit was feeding information to the traffickers. Margaret's hand clenched into a fist. We walked into an ambush. The crowd had grown larger but quieter. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of what they were witnessing. Mrs. Patterson had come out of her house and was standing at the edge of the park, her own German Shepherd, a retired police dog she'd adopted, whining softly at her side. For good men died that night, Margaret continued. For men who trusted their commanding officer, who trusted the intelligence they were given, who trusted that someone had their back. Valor pressed closer to her, a soft whine escaping his throat. Margaret's voice broke slightly as she looked down at him. Valor found me under the rubble after the explosion. I was unconscious, bleeding, probably would have died if he hadn't led the rescue team to me, but when I woke up in that field hospital 3 days later, they told me he was dead. Killed by shrapnel from the same blast that nearly killed me. Officer Mills felt her throat tighten. Ma'am, if your dog was killed, was he? Margaret's eyes blazed as she looked around at the circle of K9 South, then explained to me how he's standing here today. Explained to me how 37 police dogs from departments across 3 states all found their way to this exact spot, to this exact bench at the exact time. I decided I couldn't carry this alone anymore. The number was oddly specific, and Officer Park found himself actually counting the dogs. 37, she was right. The official report blamed me for the failed mission. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Negligent handling of classified intelligence, failure to secure the area, compromising the safety of my unit. I was stripped of my rank, dishonorably discharged, and blacklisted from any kind of government or law enforcement work. She pulled a worn photograph from her jacket pocket, the only personal item she seemed to carry. It showed her in military fatigues, younger, smiling, with Valor sitting proudly beside her, both of them in front of an American flag. I spent 3 years fighting the charges, 3 years of lawyers who wouldn't take my case of witness testimonies that mysteriously disappeared, of evidence that was classified beyond my security clearance, and every time I got close to the truth, every time someone was willing to listen, I was told that pursuing it further would be detrimental to national security. Detective Lisa Ross had arrived during Margaret's story, drawn by the increasing radio chatter about the unusual situation. Unlike the uniformed officers Detective Ross had experience with complex cases that crossed jurisdictional lines. She'd also seen enough military cover-ups to know they usually protected someone powerful. Ms. Hale, Detective Ross said, approaching slowly, I'm Detective Ross. I'd like to hear more about this, but I think we should know. Margaret's voice was firm. I'm done with private conversations, Detective. I'm done with being told that justice has to happen behind closed doors in rooms I'm not allowed to enter by people who weren't there. She turned to face the crowd, many of whom were now recording with their phones. Margaret had spent years avoiding attention, hiding from the world that had rejected her. But standing here, surrounded by these dogs who had somehow found her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The strength to fight back. The officer who filed the report that destroyed my life, who blamed me for those deaths, who had Valor listed as killed in action to prevent anyone from asking questions. His name is Colonel James Morrison. 3 months ago, he was nominated for promotion to General Detective. Ross felt her pulse quicken. She'd heard that name before, seen it in commendations and news articles. Morrison was a decorated officer, a war hero, someone being groomed for the highest levels of military leadership. Miss Hale, those are serious accusations. They're not accusations, Detective, they're facts, and I have proof. Margaret reached into her other pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. 12 years of investigation, 12 years of collecting evidence, of following money trails, of documenting communications. I may have been discharged, but I never stopped being a soldier, and soldiers don't abandon their brothers. Valor. Tail wagged for the first time that morning, as if he understood that his partner, his real partner, was finally ready to fight 3 days ago. I received a phone call from someone I didn't expect to hear from, someone who was there that night, who's been living with the same guilt I have, who finally found the courage to come forward. Margaret looked directly into the news camera that had appeared at the edge of the crowd. Master Sergeant David Chun, Mrs. Chun's son. Actually, she nodded toward Sarah's mother. He's been stationed in Germany for the past 5 years. He was supposed to testify in my defense 12 years ago, but his orders were mysteriously changed the day before the hearing. He was deployed to a classified location and told that any attempt to contact me or discuss the Afghanistan operation would result in court martial. Mrs. Chen's face went white. Her son, David, had been in the military, yes, but he'd never talked about his deployment, never explained why he'd seemed so different when he came back, why he'd left active duty and moved overseas. David told me something that I suspected but could never prove. Margaret, continued Colonel Morrison, wasn't just feeding information to the traffickers. He was one of them. That drug money was funding his own private operations, off-the-books missions that made him look like a hero while getting good soldiers killed. A park had gone completely silent except for the soft panting of the dogs and the distant sound of traffic. Detective Ross found herself believing every word, even as the cop part of her brain screamed that this was impossible, that accusations like this needed evidence, needed proof beyond the word of a discharged veteran and a USB drive that could contain anything. But then she looked at the dogs, 37 highly trained animals from departments that had never worked together, somehow all present at exactly the right moment. Dogs who were trained to detect lies, to sense danger, to protect and serve, and they were all protecting Margaret. Ms. Hale, Detective Ross said carefully, if what you're saying is true, if you have evidence of criminal activity by a high-ranking military officer, then we need to do it right. This time Margaret interrupted. No closed-door meetings, no classified hearings, no evidence that disappears into bureaucratic black holes. She held up the USB drive for everyone to see. Everything's here: financial records, communications, witness testimonies, mission logs that contradict the official reports, and it's not just on this drive. It's been copied, distributed, uploaded to secure servers. The truth can't be buried. Valor whipped up at her with what could only be described as pride, and Margaret smiled for the first time in years. The question is, Detective Razar, you ready to help me bring a war criminal to justice? Detective Ross found herself at a crossroads that would define her career. The smart move, the safe move, would be to escort Margaret to the station, confiscate the USB drive, and let federal authorities handle what was clearly going to be a jurisdictional nightmare. But something about the scene in front of her, something about the way these dogs had materialized to protect this woman, made her trust her instincts over Miss Hale, she said, pulling out her phone, I'm going to call the district attorney. If you're willing to make a formal statement, if your evidence is as solid as you claim, then we're going to do this by the book, the real book, not the one that failed you before. Margaret nodded, but her expression remained guarded. Before you make that call, Detective, you need to understand exactly what you're getting into. What happened to me, it wasn't just professional retaliation, it was personal, and it was designed to destroy more than just my career. She sat back down on the bench, Valor immediately resuming his position at her side. The other dogs remained motionless, but Detective Russ noticed that several of them had shifted slightly, creating clearer sight to all the park entrances. Even in this surreal situation, their training was evident. The mission that killed my minute was supposed to be my last before coming home. I had orders to report to Fort Bragg for reassignment. I was going to marry my fiancé, David Kramer. He was a detective with the Baltimore Police Department, and we'd been planning our wedding for 2 years. Mrs. Chen stepped forward from the crowd. Ms. Hale, if this is too personal. No, it's not too personal. It's the heart of everything. Margaret's voice was steady but filled with old pain. You see, David Kramer wasn't just my fiancé. He was investigating a series of drug-related murders in Baltimore that traced back to the same trafficking network we were hunting in Afghanistan. He didn't know about my mission, operational security, but our investigations were converging on the same target. Detective Ross felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Morrison knew about your fiancé's investigation. Knew everything. He had contacts throughout law enforcement, favors owed, information traded. When David got too close to the truth, when he started asking questions about military connections to the drug trade, Margaret's voice trailed off. Mills, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up sharply. What happened to him? Margaret pulled out her phone and showed them a news article, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. The headline read, Baltimore detective killed in line of duty. Bust gone wrong. 3 days before I was supposed to come home, 3 days before our wedding, David was killed in what was officially ruled a tragic miscommunication during a multi-agency drug raid. The crowd had grown even larger, but the atmosphere had shifted. People weren't just curious anymore, they were angry. The idea that a soldier and a police officer had been systematically destroyed to protect a corrupt superior officer touched something deep in their collective sense of justice. I didn't learn about David's death until after I was discharged, Margaret continued. I was in military custody facing charges. Forbidden from making personal phone calls. When they finally told me, they said it was a tragic coincidence to separate investigations to separate agencies, no connections. She stood again, her hands shaking with suppressed rage, but there was a connection, Detective Ross. David had uncovered evidence that military equipment was being used to transport drugs from Afghanistan into the United States, equipment that was supposed to be returning from completed tours of duty but was making stops in Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, cities where Morrison had contacts where he could move product without attracting federal attention. Ross was furiously taking notes, her mind racing through the implications. Ms. Hale, if you're alleging that a military officer was running drugs through official transport channels, I'm not alleging anything, Detective. I'm stating facts. Facts that cost David his life, that cost 4 good soldiers their lives, that would have cost me my life if Valor hadn't found me in that ruble. She knelt beside the scarred German shepherd, her hands gently tracing the scar that ran along his face. After the explosion, while I was unconscious in the field hospital, Morrison visited me. The nurses thought it was touching a commanding officer checking on his wounded soldier. But I wasn't unconscious the whole time. I heard him talking to someone on the phone. Someone, he called the client. He said the problem was contained, that the evidence had been destroyed, that there would be no more interference from either end. Valor, wind softly pressing closer to Margaret, as if he remembered that day. 2. When I woke up fully 2 days later, they told me Valor was dead. They said he'd died trying to protect me, that he was a hero. They even gave me his collar. Margaret's voice broke. I carried that collar for 3 years, mourning, the only partner who'd ever truly understood me, the only witness who could have corroborated my story. Officer Park looked around at the circle of dogs, all of them still as statues. But he wasn't dead. No, he wasn't. Morrison had him transferred to a domestic unit, his records falsified to show he'd been killed in action. New name, new handler, new identity. But dogs don't forget, Officer Park, and they don't forgive. Detective Ross was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just about a military cover-up, it was about a systematic conspiracy that had reached into civilian law enforcement, that had gotten officers killed to protect a criminal enterprise. Ms. Hale, how did you find all this out? How did you trace more activities across 12 years without any official support? Margaret smiled grimly. I became very good at being invisible, Detective. When you're blacklisted from law enforcement, when you can't get a job anywhere, that requires a background check. You learn to survive in the margins, and you meet other people who've been pushed to the margins. People who know things, who see things, who remember things that powerful people wish they'd forget. She gestured to the crowd around them, many of whom were law enforcement officers who had arrived off duty after hearing about the situation. Sir Morrison made one crucial mistake. He assumed that destroying my career would silence me. He never considered that there might be others, other soldiers, other cops, other people who'd been hurt by his network, who were waiting for someone brave enough to speak. First, Detective Ross's phone buzzed with a text message. The district attorney wanted to meet immediately. Federal agents were being dispatched. The media attention was growing beyond what the local department could handle. Ms. Hale, she said, I believe you. I don't know why, but I believe every word you've said. But if we're going to do this, if we're going to bring down someone with more connections and power, we need to be smarter than he is. Margaret nodded. That's why I waited until today, Detective. That's why I waited until I knew Valor was alive, until I knew the evidence was secure, until I knew the truth couldn't be buried again. Looked around at the dogs surrounding her, and for the first time, Detective Ross noticed something she'd missed. Before, many of them were scarred. Not unusual for working dogs, but these scars looked similar, deliberate, like they'd all been through the same kind of hell. These aren't random police dogs, are they? Detective Ross asked quietly. Margaret's smile was sad, but proud. No, Detective. These are Morrison's other victims' dogs, who were supposed to be dead, handlers who were supposed to stay silent, cases that were supposed to stay closed. Morrison's network is bigger than you can imagine, but so is ours. She stood and faced the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the silent park. Today, we stop running. Today, we stop hiding. Today, we bring our brothers home. Brothers home. As if responding to a silent command, every dog in the circle raised their head and let out a single unified howl that seemed to echo through the entire city. Detective Ross had seen many cases that challenged her faith in the system, but nothing had prepared her for what she discovered when she ran Margaret's name through the database. What she found, or rather what she didn't find, confirmed every suspicion that had been growing since she'd listened to Margaret's story. Margaret Hale's military record was clean to clean. No mention of disciplinary action, no record of discharge proceedings, no documentation of the charges that had supposedly ended her career. According to official records, Staff Sergeant Margaret Hale had completed her tour of duty and received an honorable discharge with full benefits. But when Detective Ross called the VA to verify Margaret's benefit status, she was told that no such person existed in their system. It was as if someone had carefully erased half of Margaret's life. Captain Martinez, Detective Ross, called to her supervisor who had arrived with the growing crowd of officials descending on the park. I need to show you something. Captain Martinez was a 20-year veteran who'd seen enough bureaucratic games to be skeptical of both accusations and cover-ups. But when Detective Ross showed him the discrepancies in Margaret's records, his expression darkened. "This is federal-level work," he muttered. "Local departments don't have the access to make changes like this." Meanwhile, Margaret had agreed to move their conversation to a nearby community center with the condition that everything remained public and on record. The dogs had followed, maintaining their protective formation. Even as they moved through the streets, local news crews were now joined by national outlets, and social media was exploding with videos of the dog army marching through downtown. At the community center, Margaret connected her USB drive to a borrowed laptop and began displaying documents on a large screen that had been set up for the growing audience of officials, media, and citizens. This is a financial record from a bank in the Cayman Islands. She began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Account holder, James Morrison. The deposits match exactly with the timeline of our operations in Afghanistan, and the people amounts correspond to the street value of the drugs that were supposed to be destroyed but instead disappeared. Agent Sarah Williams, who had driven down from the regional office, leaned forward to study the documents. "Ms. Hale, how did you obtain these financial records?" Margaret's smile was grim. "Agent Williams, for 12 years, I've been living in the shadows of society. You'd be amazed what you can learn when you have nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to learn it." The next document was a communication log showing encrypted messages between Morrison and several unknown contacts. The times corresponded with the dates of the failed missions, the deaths of her teammates, and David Kramer's murder in Baltimore. "This message here," Margaret pointed to a specific entry, "was sent 3 hours before David was killed. It says problem needs permanent solution. Make it look routine." Detective Ross felt sick. She'd seen enough cases to know that David Kramer's death had been an assassination disguised as a line of duty tragedy, but the most damning evidence was yet to come. "This," Margaret said, pulling up a video file, "is security footage from the military hospital where I was treated after the explosion. It shows Morrison entering my room while I was unconscious and planting evidence in my personal belongings." The grainy black and white video clearly showed a man in military uniform placing something in Margaret's duffel bag. While she lay motionless in the hospital bed, "He planted heroin," Margaret said simply. "When they searched my belongings during the investigation, they found drugs." It supported their narrative that I was involved in the trafficking network, that I'd gone rogue and gotten my team killed. Agent Williams paused the video and enhanced the image. The man's face was clearly visible and his uniform clearly showed Morrison's rank and name as Hal. "This evidence, if it's authentic, it proves criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of military command. It's authentic, Agent Williams, and there's more." Margaret pulled up a roster of names, dozens of military personnel, law enforcement officers, and civilians. Next to each name was a status: killed in action, died in line of duty, suicide, missing, discredited, discharged. "These are Morrison's other victims," Margaret explained. "Anyone who got too close to his operation, anyone who asked too many questions, anyone who might have exposed the truth. Some were killed. Others, like me, were destroyed professionally and personally." Valor, who had been lying quietly beside Margaret throughout the presentation, suddenly stood and walked to the door. The other dogs immediately became alert, forming a defensive perimeter round Margaret. "What's wrong with them?" Agent Williams asked. Margaret looked at Valor, and something passed between them, a communication that went beyond words, beyond training, beyond the normal bond between human and animal. "They're warning us," Margaret said quietly. "Someone's coming, someone who doesn't want this information to get out." Through the windows of the community center, they could see a convoy of black SUVs pulling into the parking lot. Men in dark suits and military uniforms were emerging, moving with the purposeful stride of people who were used to being obeyed without question. "Is Haley," Agent Williams said urgently. "We need to get you into protective custody immediately." "No," Margaret replied, her voice calm but firm. "I've spent 12 years in hiding. Agent Williams, I'm done running." She turned to address the crowd that had filled the community center: reporters, citizens off duty, police officers, and local officials who had come to witness what was being called the most significant military corruption case in decades. "What you're about to see," Margaret said, "is exactly what happened 12 years ago when I tried to report Morrison's crimes through official channels. They're going to try to shut this down, to classify everything, to make all of this disappear. Just like they made me disappear." The dogs had moved into a tight formation around Margaret, their training evident in their coordinated positioning. These weren't just pets or even ordinary working dogs. These were warriors, and they recognized that their fight wasn't over. Detective Ross stepped forward, her hand moving instinctively to her weapon. "Ms. Hale, we're not going to let that happen." Captain Martinez nodded his agreement. "This is a local investigation now. They want to take over. They're going to have to go through proper legal channels. The doors to the community center opened, and Colonel James Morrison walked in flanked by military police and federal agents. He was exactly what Margaret had described. Tall, distinguished with the bearing of a man who expected immediate obedience from everyone around him, but when he saw Margaret, when he saw Valor standing protectively beside her, his composure cracked for just a moment. It was enough to confirm everything Margaret had said. Staff Sergeant Hale Morrison said, his voice carrying military authority, "You are in violation of your security clearance agreement. The information you're disseminating is classified, and its release constitutes treason." Margaret stood slowly, Valor rising with her around them. The other dogs tensed, ready to act on her commandium. "Not Staff Sergeant Hale anymore, Colonel Morrison," she replied. "You made sure of that 12 years ago, and the only treason here is what you did to my team too, David Kramer, and to every person on that list." Morrison's eyes flicked to the screen, showing the names of his victims, and Margaret saw something she'd never seen before. Fear. For 12 years, he'd believed his secrets were safe. He'd believed that discrediting Margaret would be enough, that no one would believe a discharged veteran with PTSD over a decorated war hero had never imagined that his victims would find each other. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Morrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "The operations I've conducted have saved American lives, have protected national security by selling drugs to American children." Margaret interrupted. "By murdering American police officers, by getting American soldiers killed to cover your tracks." The room was completely silent except for the soft panting of the dogs and the whir of news cameras capturing every word. "Colonel Morrison," Agent Williams said, stepping forward with her credentials displayed, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, drug trafficking, and treason." Morrison's military escorts made a move to intervene, but they found themselves facing not just local law enforcement, but 37 highly trained German shepherds who looked more than ready to defend Margaret Hale for the first time in 12 years. Margaret allowed herself to believe that justice might actually be possible. 6 months later, Margaret Hale sat in the witness box of a federal courtroom, her hand resting on a Bible, as she prepared to give the testimony that had been silenced for over a decade. Valor lay at her feet, not as emotional support but as an official witness whose presence had been approved by the judge after Margaret's lawyers argued that the dog's testimony was as crucial as any human witness. The courtroom was packed. What had started as a small-town incident in a park had become a national story that exposed corruption reaching from local police departments to the highest levels of military command. The trial of Colonel James Morrison had become a symbol of accountability, a test of whether justice could prevail even when the accused held positions of ultimate trust and authority. Sat at the defense table, still maintaining his military bearing but looking older, diminished by the weight of evidence that had mounted against him over months of investigation. His legal team had argued that he was a patriot who had made difficult decisions in an impossible situation, that his actions had been authorized through classified channels that couldn't be discussed in open court. But Margaret's evidence had been too comprehensive, too detailed, and too well documented to Hale, the federal prosecutor, began. "Please tell the court what happened on the night of October 15th, 12 years ago." Margaret's voice was clear and strong as she recounted the ambush that had killed her teammates, the explosion that should have killed her, and Morrison's visit to her hospital room while she was unconscious. But it wasn't just her testimony that was damning. It was the mountain of corroborating evidence she had spent 12 years collecting. Financial records showed millions of dollars flowing through Morrison's accounts. Communication intercepts revealed his coordination with drug traffickers. Witness testimony from other surviving soldiers supported Margaret's version of events. Even the heroin that had been planted in her belongings had been tested and traced back to the same network Morrison had been supposedly fighting. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Margaret was asked about the dogs that had surrounded her that morning in the park. "Your Honor," Margaret said, looking directly at the judge, "these animals served their country just as faithfully as any soldier. When their handlers were killed or discredited or silenced, these dogs were often reassigned. Their identities changed, their service records altered to hide what they'd witnessed." She gestured toward the gallery, where several of the canine officers and their current handlers were seated. Many of the dogs that had appeared that morning had been identified, their true histories uncovered. Through Margaret's investigation, Valor wasn't the only dog Morrison reported as killed in action. There were 17 others from various operations, all of whom are alive and serving in different departments, under different names. Morrison used these false death reports to eliminate witnesses, not just human witnesses, but canine ones who had been trained to detect the very drugs he was trafficking. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man who specialized in military cases, stood for cross-examination. "Miss Hale, isn't it true that you've suffered from PTSD since your deployment, that you've been unable to maintain steady employment, that you've lived as a recluse for over a decade?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Yes, counselor, I have PTSD. I've struggled with nightmares, with trust issues, with the knowledge that my teammates died because of someone they trusted. But trauma doesn't make someone a liar, it makes them a survivor. And survivors remember everything, but isn't it possible, the defense attorney pressed, that your memories have been distorted by your condition? That what you perceive as a conspiracy is actually the tragic but lawful consequences of a military operation that went wrong? Before Margaret could answer, Valor stood up in the witness box. The courtroom fell silent as the scarred German Shepherd walked to the evidence table where Morrison's personal effects were displayed. Items that had been seized during his arrest. Valor stopped in front of a military decorations case and began barking the same alert signal he'd been trained to give when detecting narcotics. The judge looked puzzled. "Counselor, what is your client's dog responding to?" Margaret's attorney quickly stood. "Your Honor, we request permission to have that decorations case tested for drug residue." Valor is alerting exactly as he was trained to do when detecting narcotics. Morrison's face went pale. His attorney objected strenuously, but the judge allowed the test. Within minutes, a field testing kit confirmed the presence of heroin residue inside the metal case, the same type of heroin that had been found in Margaret's hospital belongings. 12 years earlier, the implication was clear. Morrison had been so arrogant, so confident in his immunity from investigation that he'd kept trophies from his crimes. The very medals he'd received for his heroic service had been contaminated by the drugs he'd trafficked as. The trial progressed over the following weeks. More witnesses came forward. Master Sergeant David Chen testified via video link from Germany, corroborating Margaret's account and revealing additional evidence he'd been forced to suppress for over a decade. Other surviving soldiers spoke of missions that had been compromised, of operations that had felt more like setups than legitimate military actions, but perhaps the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. Morrison's former aide, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, who had been quietly collecting evidence for years, waiting for someone brave enough to break the silence. Colonel Morrison didn't just run one trafficking operation, Torres testified. He ran a network that stretched across multiple theaters of operation, multiple branches of service, and multiple civilian law enforcement agencies. He used his position to identify and eliminate anyone who might threaten his activity: soldiers, cops, federal agents, even military contractors who asked too many questions. The prosecution presented evidence of at least 37 deaths that could be traced back to Morrison's network, the same number as the dogs that had surrounded Margaret in the park that October morning. It seemed impossible to believe it was a coincidence. During the defense's case, Morrison finally took the stand. In his own defense, he maintained his innocence, claimed that his actions had been authorized at the highest levels of government, insisted that he was being scapegoated for operations that were necessary to protect American interests abroad. But when Margaret's attorney cross-examined him, when he was forced to explain the financial records, the planted evidence, the falsified death reports, his composure finally cracked. "You don't understand," Morrison said, his voice rising. "In war, there are casualties. Good people die so that better people can live. I made the hard choices that politicians and bureaucrats were too weak to make, including the choice to murder Baltimore Police Detective David Kramer." The prosecutor asked Morrison's silence was answer enough. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered verdicts on all counts: guilty of conspiracy, guilty of drug trafficking, guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of treasonous. The judge read the sentence: life in prison without possibility of parole. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in over 12 years. Peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of justice. Not the end of her trauma, but the validation that her fight had been worth it. Outside the courthouse, Margaret stood surrounded by many of the same dogs that had found her in the park 6 months earlier. Their handlers, good cops and soldiers, who had never known the true history of their partners, stood with her in solidarity. Detective Ross, who had become the lead investigator on the case and had been promoted to lieutenant for her work, handed Margaret an envelope. "What's this?" Margaret asked her military records. Ross replied, "The real ones. The Army is preparing a formal apology and full restoration of your rank and benefits. There's also talk of a congressional hearing about military accountability and whistleblower protection." Margaret opened the envelope and saw documents she'd never thought she'd see again. Her commendations, her service record, her honorable discharge papers. At the bottom was a handwritten note from the Secretary of the Army. "Thank you for your service to your country, and thank you for never giving up the fight for justice." But the moment that meant the most came when Valor's official handler, Officer Maria Santos, approached with paperwork of her own. "Ms. Hale," she said, "Valor's been an exceptional partner for the past 3 years, but watching him with you, I've never seen a bond like that. The department has approved his retirement effective immediately. He's earned the right to go home." Margaret knelt beside Valor, the scarred German Shepherd, who had never stopped believing in her, who had somehow found a way to bring justice out of the shadows and into the light. As she wrapped her arms around him, she felt tears on her cheeks. Not tears of pain this time, but tears of gratitude. "We did it, partner," she whispered into his ear. "We brought them all home." As the sun set behind the courthouse, Margaret walked away from the building where she'd finally received the justice that had been denied to her for over a decade. Valor walked beside her, no longer a witness to tragedy, but a companion in triumph. Behind him, 36 other canine officers and their Handlers formed an honor guard, a testament to the truth that some bonds can never be broken. Some justice can never be permanently denied, and some heroes refuse to be silenced, no matter how powerful their enemies or how long the fight. The small park where it all began had been renamed in honor of the 4 soldiers who died in Afghanistan, and Detective David Kramer, who died in Baltimore. A memorial statue showed a soldier and a police officer standing back to back with a German shepherd. At their feet, a reminder that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes justice arrives on 4 legs when it can't walk on 2. Margaret Hale had spent 12 years in exile, branded as a traitor and a failure, but she had never stopped being a soldier, never stopped fighting for her team, never stopped believing that the truth would eventually find its way into the light. And, in the end, it was the love between a soldier and her partner, between comrades who refused to abandon each other, between people who believe that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost, that brought down one of the most corrupt military officers in American history. As Margaret and Valor walked home together through the streets of the city that had finally heard her story, children playing in yards stopped to wave at them. Their parents, who had watched the trial on television, nodded respectfully. Shop owners came out of their stores to shake Margaret's hand and pet the dog, who had become a national symbol of loyalty and justice. But Margaret wasn't thinking about fame or recognition. She was thinking about the 4 men who had died in Afghanistan, about David Kramer, who had died in Baltimore, about all the other victims of Morrison's network who would never see justice in this life. She was also thinking about new beginnings, about the future she could finally build now that the past had been settled. The Army had offered her a position as an instructor at their canine training facility. The FBI had approached her about consulting on corruption cases. Publishers wanted to buy the rights to her story, but tonight all she wanted was to sit on her front porch with Valor, watching the stars and remembering what it felt like to be at peace. The nightmare was finally over. The fight was finally won, and for the first time in 12 years, Staff Sergeant Margaret Hale could sleep without fear, protected by the knowledge that justice had been served and that her partner, her faithful, brave, loyal partner, was finally home where he belonged.